So just quickly about the duodenum, because this is misplaced in the days, because tomorrow I'm mainly going to talk about things which are not cancer. So very difficult decision. I remember very clearly when I was a trainee, I took a lovely photo of something in the duodenum and I went to show my boss it. And I said to him, "What should we do with this?" And he looked at me and said, "Tate, that's for a surgeon." And I still remember it because this was definitely not for a surgeon. This was a duodenal adenoma. And does that mean that he didn't know what a duodenal adenoma was? Because I certainly didn't. Or did he think that all duodenal adenomas are treated by surgery? Whichever of those two things is the case, they're both wrong. So this is what duodenal adenomas look like, or what they are. So they can be part of polyposis syndromes, as in they're multiple, or they can be sporadic, and usually they are on their own. Patients are usually totally asymptomatic, and they normally detected late in life. Most of them are in the second part of the duodenum, and most of them are on their own. They're usually flat or sessile. There are two real technical morphologies of duodenal polyps, so they don't really look like colon polyps. They have a different appearance. They don't really exhibit the same morphology, because you do, of course, have different morphologies of colon polyps. It doesn't really hold true for the duodenum. But what definitely holds true for the duodenum, like it holds true for the stomach, the esophagus, and the colon, is that if it's irregular, then you should worry about it. And it's very useful in the duodenum to have a cap on to image these things. Of course, there are two types. Very important distinction is, does it involve the ampulla? And I've shown you today how to image the ampulla with a forward viewing scope. So, of course, you should always try and do it. Why? Because you may detect a ampullary lesion that way. They have malignant potential, not high, much less than the malignant potential of colon polyps, and much less than the malignant potential of gastric polyps. And esophageal doesn't really have polyps, but significantly less than esophageal lesions, but still there. And that's why it's more difficult to decide whether to resect these or not, because of the fact that maybe they will never become cancer. So maybe there are three. In fact, I hadn't really considered this one. This is probably a bit similar to this with a different imaging platform, I think. Whereas these, there are the other type, which are red and flat. And these ones you can easily miss, because these ones are quite similar to the background mucosa, whereas these are very uncommonly missed. They often contain zones within them which people think are demarcated areas and worry about, but these are also usually nothing to worry about in the duodenum. I'll show you a picture of one. We managed to find one in our database of images, which is one to worry about, because all the others were completely benign. And I think that tells you that they normally are. So again, you see here that this is, for me, a sort of standard duodenal polyp. Yes, it's a bit more bulky than the standard one, but there's nothing in this to be very concerned about. It's really not easy. It's actually much more difficult to handle than the colon. John, have you got any comments on that? We're touching on resection. It's maybe interesting to get your opinion as well.
So I'm very much a cold person, David. I've used hot. In fact, I prompted a global email to everyone I knew following two significant complications, one bleeding, one perforation, following duodenal resections. And everyone said, firstly, this is what we call tiger country, is dangerous. It's just a dangerous place to be. Secondly, there was absolutely no consensus of approach.
We don't see you, John. Can we see your beautiful face? Sorry.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, and then thirdly, I then took the safest measure, and a bit like you, I audit my practice, David. And since I've switched predominantly to cold, and I only usually use heat if it's so bulky I can't cut through the perforating vessel, which is feeding the tissue above, which usually means it's a bulky lesion. I haven't had that sort of recurrence rate that's been quoted in the paper. My recurrence rate is really small, and I also follow them up 12 months and then deal with any recurrence at that period of time. But to date, since I changed my practice, I haven't seen that recurrence rate with cold snaring, and I certainly haven't had a complication in the magnitude that I had before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something to really underline the complications of duodenal EMR. So we're now talking about hot, right? We're not talking about cold. The biggest, worst thing you're going to do, as John says, to someone with a cold snare is give them recurrence, which is not ideal, but you're not going to kill them. Whereas with the EMR, any hot snare, we have all had, I have had, significant complications in the duodenum. And these are the worst complications I have had in my endoscopic resection practice. So do not think just because, you know, you can do colon EMR of 50 millimeters that you should be out there doing duodenal EMR. You should really think about carefully before you are doing that, especially if the patient's elderly, right? Especially if this patient is never going to get a problem. And so that takes us to this summary slide. Look for them, but especially look for them in the elderly, but also consider whether ever you should resect them in the elderly, because you need to have that discussion with the patient. And the size is probably the thing that's going to drive you, or set any disorder pattern, but you're probably not going to find that. We didn't cover ampullary lesions because it's way outside the scope of this, but you must consider that they occur and refer them to an expert. Use a distal attachment to see the papilla. Think about anything. If you're considering doing cold snare polypectomy, do not do it near the major papilla. And that requires you to know where the major papilla is. So hopefully from this course, you got that part at least, but please don't take it away. What are you trying to achieve? Possibly the patient's in hospital. I mean, I know of a patient who had a cold snare polypectomy, right, in the duodenum, next day admitted to ICU, in hospital for 3 months with pancreatitis. And that's because they had a cold snare of what was thought to be a polyp, and it was the papilla. So you just have to be careful, and that, you know, really just think about the patient, because what was the benefit to that patient of having that cold snare polypectomy? Nothing. And the negative was enormous. So and finally, yeah, I think if there are multiple, then consider the fact that the patient might have a polyposis syndrome. If they never had a colonoscopy, it's something to think about doing. Fine. I think the room is ready. So David and I will go to the room.